Welcome to Beg to Differ, the Bulwark's weekly roundtable discussion featuring civil conversation across the political spectrum from center left to center right. I'm Mona Charon, syndicated columnist and policy editor at the Bulwark. I'm joined by our regulars, Bill Galston of the Brookings Institution and the Wall Street Journal, Linda Chavez of the Niskanen Center, and Damon Linker of The Week. Our special return guest, one of our favorites, is Will Saletan of Slate. So thank you, one and all. Will, it's great to have you back.
Thanks. I'm here and ready to beg.
All right, very good. So this week we had a fairly interesting Saturday morning where it looked for a few minutes as if the Senate might actually call witnesses, and there was a certain amount of flurry of excitement. And then that didn't happen, and we know how the vote went. And in the interim now, there is a lot of discussion about what some people are calling the new Cold War between the institutional Republicans led by Mitch McConnell and the Trump brand. So I'm going to start with you, Will. You've had some really, really strong, wonderful pieces lately about what Trump has meant for the Republican Party, and I want to get to that. But first, what is your sense of the relative strength of the opposing forces here?
Well, the Trump forces have the upper hand within the party. That's evidenced partly by the impeachment vote itself, and partly by the refusal of Republican senators, those who are up for election in 2022, when they were asked by Politico about the feud between Trump and now minority leader Mitch McConnell, to stand up for McConnell, who simply stood. All McConnell did was stand up during the impeachment process and say that although he was acquitting Trump because Trump was no longer president, Trump was absolutely morally guilty of having incited the attack on the Capitol. Everything McConnell said was true. That was, to my mind, the reasonable and politically defensible position for Republicans to take. And yet McConnell himself was rebuked by his own members, by Senator Lindsey Graham, by Senator Ron Johnson, and nobody is standing up for him, which tells me that the Republican Party has almost completely capitulated to Trump, even after Trump no longer nominally has the power of the presidency. So I don't see much hope forward for the anti-Trump wing of the party.
Damon, several county Republican committees in Mitch McConnell's home state of Kentucky have rebuked him. And the chairman of one county party wrote that McConnell should resign his leadership position because of his complete and total disdain for the will of his constituents.
Yeah, well, you've seen statements like this from around the country, really going all the way back to the election itself, and Trump beginning to stir up his opposition to the results of the election. That these there were some local officials who stood up to him and certified their votes, but plenty of others who really took a public stand in taking his side against the results of the election. Because you had a mix of results back then, you had a mix of some local officials standing with the norms of counting and certifying votes, and then others who were standing up in opposition to that. It was a little unclear where people would come down. But now, as Will, I think, said very eloquently, we're at the point now where it appears the bulk of prevailing opinion in the party throughout the country seems to be with Trump and against the position that McConnell staked out in that statement on Saturday late afternoon after the vote. And it's a very demoralizing thing to behold, I think, to realize that, as Will said, McConnell, nothing he said was controversial. It was a kind of standard, sane interpretation of what Trump was doing in those in those weeks between the election and the insurrection on the 6th of January, and yet no one is rising in his defense or echoing the statement. And even McConnell himself on Wednesday appeared to back down. He was asked because Trump also issued his own blistering statement on Tuesday, a 2-page long, single spaced broadside against the Senate Minority Leader, mocking him and the usual Trumpian lies about how, we lost the Senate because of McConnell in Georgia, rather than the reality, which is, of course, that it's much more likely to assume, much more true to facts, that the party came up short in the Georgia elections in January, because Trump and his supporters were saying that if you vote, it won't be a legitimate vote, that you can't trust anyone in charge in the party with a legitimate election.
Yeah,
So,
Damon, can I interrupt you for just 1 minute though to dwell on this letter for just a second?
sure.
First of all, it's pretty clear that Trump didn't write all of it, because the word "doer" appears in the first sentence.
Yes, absolutely. He
Yeah,
doesn't.
yeah,
He wouldn't
yeah.
even know how to pronounce that word.
Right. So that was pretty clear. But the other part of this, that we've gotten so used to it, but it's still just gobsmacking that Trump can lodge these crazy accusations, say, and he's got these connections to China, and so on and so forth. Now, if that were true, if he had sketchy relationships with China, why in the world would Trump have had his wife as one of his cabinet members? Why would he never have thought to raise this as a problem before? But that sort of logic, it doesn't matter. People just say, well, yeah, but I mean, he fights.
And he absolutely does. I mean, that's what you see over and over again. If you turn on him, he will come after you and try to tear you down. And he did in this letter. And the next day, the press asked McConnell for a comment, and he just deflected. Oh, well, we're moving on from that. No need to keep talking about that. Which I guess I sort of understand, because what is he going to do? Spend the next 2 years in this shouting
Right.
match with the former president? That's not in his interest or the interests of the party. But it could be in the interests of the party if he had some traction on his side, and there was some hope of actually exiling Trump from the party through such a conflict. But he knows there is no such hope, and so it's much more sensible for him to just try to change the subject. And again, that shows us, I think, where we are.
Linda, there have been a lot of chin pulling pieces in the last few days, not to disparage them. I mean, they've been good, but, pointing out that the base of the Republican Party is where it is. And therefore, these Republicans who are voting to stick with Trump are doing the logical thing for them, and that's just the way it is. And I have something that bothers me about all of this analysis is, well, that is what we have because they've never chosen, the leadership, the elites have never chosen to try to, have a united front against Trump. I mean, frankly, if all of the Republican senators had held hands, and said, we're all going to vote this way, what would the Trump team have been able to do to them? Are they going to primary them all? Or that, I mean, it would have sent a really strong signal, and it would have been very tough for Trump to strike back at all of them.
That's exactly right. And it's something we've talked about a lot on this program. You needed a critical mass. We never attained that. The only person who has spoken up, I think, in the wake of the letter to McConnell, John Thune has basically, said he sticks by his guns on what he has said. But you have figures like Ron Johnson, who apparently thinks that because every single person who stormed the Capitol wasn't carrying an AK-47 with multiple rounds of ammunition, that it was not an armed insurrection.
Right.
I mean, that is really where we are now. And you're absolutely right. What is lacking in the GOP right now is leadership. And in that vacuum of leadership, the only person who asserts himself is Donald Trump. There's no one there to counter him. There is no force that's pushing back against Trump and Trumpism. It's like an open door being pushed against by Trump. And so he has, a third or so of the population, the voting population, who is with him and who will be with him no matter what. But he does not have the suburban voters that the Republican Party needs. He does not have the women who have deserted this party. He doesn't have the business leaders who like Republicans on policy basis, but don't want this craziness or this racism or xenophobia that the party has been peddling for the last several years. And yet they can't seem to come together and to say no. I mean, this is the time to do it. Trump is muzzled. He is not totally silenced. Obviously, he can release a statement. He can go on Fox News or OAN or any of the other right-wing media that he chooses, but he doesn't have Twitter. He doesn't have that immediate access to millions of followers who will follow him down whatever rabbit hole he takes them. And so this would be the time for those who are responsible in the party to stand together and to say, enough, this man has damaged our party, perhaps irreparably. It's not clear to me that the Republicans can survive. Now, I think their best hope for surviving is what the Democrats may do. And if the Democrats, go too far in their culture war, if they do things that alienate large swaths of Middle America in the Midwest and in rural areas, Republicans may still win. But this is the time when there could be an alternative to Trump, and Republican leaders like McConnell have a little bit of spine, but then they go, to jelly within a week.
Bill, I invite you to respond to anything that you've heard already, but I would also just like to tee up one thing, and that is, I don't know about you, but for me, that McConnell speech following his vote to acquit just created such cognitive dissonance. It was such a powerful speech. It was so much like what could have been written by the House managers, and then to also vote to acquit on this sort of invented, jurisdictional fig leaf ground. I just found it really strange, and I think he was really being too cute and trying to have it both ways. What did you think, or respond, as I say, to anything you've already heard?
Well, first of all, I have found it best, or at least most hopeful, in practicing politics or in writing about it, to assume that people are acting in good faith until there's solid evidence that they aren't. Mm-hmm. And so I'm prepared to take Mitch McConnell at his word. He genuinely believed that it would be outside the scope of the Senate's constitutional power to vote to convict someone who had already left federal office. And to be fair to him, there are a number of respected conservative legal scholars who take that position. I don't know a lot of non-conservative scholars who do, but that's not the point. I don't regard it as a fig leaf, and therefore I didn't experience the same kind of cognitive dissonance that you did, but I may be dead wrong about that. It doesn't come easily to me after the first Obama term to ascribe good faith to Mitch McConnell, let alone after the second Obama term with the Merrick Garland affair. But I'm going to do it anyway. But let me just make a couple of remarks about what we've already discussed. The simple fact of the matter is that Donald Trump in 2015 and 2016 understood what the base of the Republican Party wanted better than any of the professionals running against him who had spent years and in many cases decades as senior representatives of the Republican Party. And I think Republicans who are anti-Trumpers should acknowledge that fact. They didn't lose by accident. Uh, Donald Trump, I believe, understood the Tea Party and what that represented in a way that small government conservatives didn't. There's been an assumption that the Tea Party was a conservative ideological revolt in favor of small government, uh, against Obamacare, against big appropriations for TARP, et cetera, et cetera. That's just not true, right? And there's survey research to prove it. Uh, they were in favor of government payments that went to people they felt didn't deserve them. They weren't against big government. They certainly weren't against the biggest programs that the government oversees. Uh, they were populists, not conservatives. Uh, they hated liberals a lot more than they loved conservatives. And Trump figured that out. And nothing changed during Trump's term. And in my most recent Wall Street Journal column this week, I rounded up all of the survey evidence on the base's attitude. And I couldn't find any evidence that when forced to choose between Trump and establishment Republican officials, that the base was in any mood to choose the establishment. You just can't find any evidence for it. Donald Trump is the Republican Party, and the Republican Party has been thoroughly Trumpified and was largely Trumpified before Trump ever came along. That's the truth of the matter. And I'm sorry that it's depressing to lifelong Republicans, but I don't think the evidence can sustain any other conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with any of that. I would just respond by saying we don't. You know, you say he identified where the base was better than anybody else. I'm not sure that's right. I mean, Ted Cruz had a message that was very similar to Trump's. You know, we've got to get this immigration under control. That's the big thing, and you know, we have to fight the libs. And he was also he came into the Senate fighting the Senate leadership, the establishment Republicans. He had a very populist approach, and they didn't choose him. Why? Because he wasn't on The Apprentice for 12 years, and they didn't feel like they knew him the way they felt like they knew Trump, and they thought, oh, Trump's a successful businessman. You talk to all these, you look at all the focus groups, people said that over and over again. They actually believed that he was a businessman who would get things done. So I'm not so sure that it's clear that that it was completely his message. But anyway, that's water over the dam at this point, because whatever it was in 2016, it is certainly his party now, and his leadership has affected the party. And I'll just close out this segment by quoting from Will Saletan, because you had a wonderful piece a few weeks ago where you said what Trump has brought to the United States is ruthless, relentless, denialist propaganda at a scale we used to see only in dictatorships. And that is true. And we're going to have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about that when we get to our third topic. But right now, I'd like to turn, unless anybody has anything burning that they want to say on this subject, let us turn to Texas. And Will, I'm going to start with you because I know you have relatives in Texas, as do I. My oldest son was trapped for several days without heat, without power, and without water in his apartment in San Antonio. So that, okay. So in America now, we do not have problems and then have debates about how to solve them. We have blame festivals. So you had leading conservative outlets claiming that this was all the fault of windmills. Go, Will.
Okay. Well, so for folks out there who are trying, I know that, ordinary people are not as smart as us political pundits. So let me explain to the ordinary people what happened. It got really cold in Texas. And when things get cold, they freeze. Okay. So what happened is freezing tends not to care what your source of power is. The infrastructure of every energy source in Texas froze. Okay, so I'm being facetious. Obviously, ordinary people deal with this all the time, right?
Right.
The windmills, the turbines did freeze. They froze. So did the natural gas pipelines. They
Yep.
froze. So did even the one of the reactors, the nuclear reactors in Texas, stopped working. All of these pipes froze. So the idea that we're now going to, like, on the basis of the freezing, go around and picking, winners and losers. I mean, yes, it was the approved Fox News conservative right-wing line that the wind turbines freezing was the problem. You can't trust the wind turbines. So if we're going to apply the general rule that things that freeze can't be relied upon when it freezes, then basically there are no energy sources that Texas was relying on significantly that are safe from that. And I really wish that we could get away from this politics of choosing up sides. This is what Tony Fauci complained about in the case of COVID. How did it come to be that it turned into an ideological war whether to wear a mask against a respiratory virus?
Yeah.
Right? It's kind of a no-brainer. The same is true of freezing. So I'm not here to do a brief for wind power, although I think it's great. Or against nuclear power, which I also think has a role. I'm just here to tell you that freezing is the issue, and anybody who tells you that on the basis of what just happened, you should be against certain kinds of renewable energy and be in favor of fossil fuels just is not facing the fact.
So, Linda, one of the people who did this, actually, the Wall Street Journal editorial board did it, and then they had to publish another piece the following day that sort of tried to justify what they had said, except they were a little bit slippery about what they had actually said the previous day. But anyway, here was Tucker Carlson. Quote, "The Green New Deal came to Texas. The power grid in the state became totally reliant on windmills. Then it got cold and the windmills broke because that's what happens in the Green New Deal," unquote. Now, Linda, I have to tell you, I mean, I am a, sort of all of the above type when it comes to energy sources. I think, we definitely have a problem with climate, but, we should definitely, but you can't rely entirely on renewables, and you need other sources. And in general, natural gas has been really pro-environment because it replaces coal, blah, 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 blah. But when I hear the arguments that are being made in such bad faith, it just makes me want to scream and just say, fine, I'll be for the Green New Deal.
Right. Well, exactly. I mean, that is essentially the flip side of what Bill was talking about in terms of, whether you're so against the crazies on the right that you join the crazies on the left just because you hate the crazies on the right so much. And of course, that's not a good idea.
No.
And, look, I have solar on my house here and in Colorado. I love windmills. I actually think they're very attractive. I used to enjoy driving by them in Colorado. But it isn't that windmills were the problem. It's that in the Northeast where they have windmills, they winterize them so that they don't freeze when the temperatures drop. But this is a once in several decades event in Texas, where the temperatures drop this low and this fast and for this prolonged a period of time. And I do think that we've gotten to the point, you're right, we've politicized everything. We want to blame somebody instead of trying to figure it out. And the fact is, some of these things, they're Mother Nature, they're acts of God. They're not things that we can always anticipate or even that we can expect utility companies to plan for as part of their regular business. Now, should they have done a better job? Yes. Is it a little peculiar? Texas is not part of the grid that governs the eastern part of the United States or the western part. They have their own internal grid that provides energy only throughout the state of Texas. Is that a problem here? Probably, because they might have been able to pull. Although frankly the storm is so widespread, it's not clear that they could have pulled energy sources from elsewhere during this. But it's just sort of sickening that every tragedy. And it started with Katrina. It may have
Yeah.
occurred before, but it was all uh, George W. Bush's fault.
That he hated black people.
And he hated black people, right? And
Yeah.
it was. We've gotten to the point where we don't just disagree about policies. We don't just disagree about solutions. We've decided we have to make the people who disagree with us on those matters evil, with the intent to harm the other half of America. It's like we are in this constant political civil war, and you have to pick sides. And if you're on one side, you have to hate people on the other side. And I'm frankly tired of it.
Yeah, I wonder how many people are tired of it. By the way, in the discussion earlier about the Republican Party, we didn't get to this, but there are thousands of people who are leaving the party because of what happened on January 6th. So even though we stressed, the loyalty to Trump, there's another story there too. The party is getting smaller. Here, let me just. There was a Morning Consult poll that showed that. Let me find it. Yeah, that the number of there's been a decline from 42% back in November who called themselves Republicans down to 37%. Economist YouGov poll. Now, it's just one poll, who knows, but it's possibly a significant number. So Damon, we've all gotten a quick education about the power grid and how Texas has got its own. But as Linda says, I mean, this is a once in a several decade event. Most of the time, Texas has reliable and cheap, it should be said, cheap energy compared to other parts of the country. And you do have. There are always trade-offs in life. I mean, it costs money to winterize your wind turbines, and it costs money to make the other changes. So people in their ordinary lives, when they're doing their own finances, can understand the concept of trade-offs, but somehow when it gets to public policy, that gets much harder to come across. What do you think?
Well, that's true, and I'm very much in favor of cost-benefit analyses and thinking in terms of trade-offs and costs and insurance and how much do you spend to prevent against an event that might not happen for 50 years. But the problem is that we seem, for various complicated reasons, to be in a period where we've had a number of these big kind of events. With climate change, there are going to be more of them related to weather. And you have then, of course, we've had the pandemic. It's the worst pandemic in 100 years. There was a plan that was started to be put together by George W. Bush and was continued and updated by Obama. Then Trump decided to basically throw it out, ignore it, not use it for COVID-19. And you were in this strange situation where these big bad events happen that are rare and that we're not prepared for. We either aren't prepared for them, or when they happen, we're sort of not ready to implement the plan or hope we can avoid it because it's too expensive. And the end result is that we end up with human suffering and things turning out worse than they would have if we had prepared better or responded better, which just increases a kind of cynicism and anger at the institutions of government for failing to step up and protect us or fix the problem. And this can be a self-reinforcing kind of downward spiral into a kind of hostility toward government and those in charge. And that's the again, I speak as a center left guy, that is kind of the really dark side of the multi-generation long polemic against government by the right. I think that one way in which the anti-government message can win is by the government failing repeatedly, which then is used, evidence, see, government is awful, we should get rid of it. You definitely see that dynamic in what's happened to the post office with with Trump getting DeJoy appointed as Postmaster General. He very clearly, from his career, had a kind of contempt for the post office, came in, instituted all of these changes that drastically slowed down mail delivery. And it was especially bad around the Christmas season, but it's still happening now. I regularly have people say, who ship me things via the U.S. Postal Service, and it takes 3 weeks to get to me when it would have taken 3 days a couple of years ago. What's the result of that? Well, my thought is I'm going to tell anyone I buy anything from or ask someone to ship me to not use the Postal Service because it's unreliable. Use FedEx or UPS or some other service. And what's the result of that change? Well, if a lot of people do what I'm doing, then the Postal Service is doing much worse than it was before. And then Republicans can go and say, look, we should defund this even further and get rid of it because it's ineffective. But one reason it's ineffective is because Republican governance has made it that way. And so I'm distressed by a kind of intentional embrace of failure as a kind of ratchet to move an anti-government message further and further down the line.
Yeah, I hear you. I agree in part. At the same time, the anti-government posture, where when it's just reflexive, is obviously simple-minded, but so is the pro-government posture. That government can come in and fix things, and that government, unlike business, is dispassionate and has none of its own interests and so on. And I don't think that's actually the way things work either. I mean, for example, maybe next week we'll talk about the schools, but we have not had the reopening of schools in a lot of communities in the United States when the studies show that they are not severe vectors for disease. And when not having schools open is a huge hardship. Why is this? Well, because government is sometimes responsive to very powerful private interests, in this case, the teachers' unions. And so, the idea that a benevolent state can always make things better is also not true. So anyway, that's my little sermonette for the moment. And we can come back to that when we talk about school reopening, which I hope we will do next week. But unless anybody has anything further to add about Texas, by the way, Will, I hope your family is now okay.
Yeah, power's back on. Of course, it could be off in a couple of hours, but for now,
right. So yeah, so
Mona,
my son is better. Yeah, Bill.
Bill, you never called on me about
Oh,
Texas.
sorry, Bill. Go.
That's okay. So, but I know it's time to move on, so I'll be brief. About a year and a half ago, I noticed something which is quite simple-minded, but also I think has enormous significance. And I've noticed a couple of economists writing about it more recently, namely that there is a trade-off between efficiency and low prices on the one hand, and what people are coming to call resilience on the other. And you can define resilience as the ability to perform even in the face of low probability, high impact events. I lived in Texas for 10 years, and I learned a lot of things about Texas during that period. And one of them is that the popular belief about rugged independence as the center of Texas consciousness is not wrong. However much it may be betrayed and introduced in practice, that's what they really believe the good life is and what the good person is. That's part of it. Another thing I noticed about Texas is that people understandably spend a lot more time worrying about excessive heat than about paralyzing snowfalls, because they simply didn't experience paralyzing snowfalls. And it's a very tough sell for government to say, or for government to order private industry to prepare against what appear to be extremely low probability events. That's why when I got to Washington D.C. and there was the first snowstorm, I was flabbergasted that the city treated it as an event that they had no responsibility to do anything about. Why? Uh, because it made no sense to a series of city governments up pretty close to the present date to have anything like a snowplow inventory, because what's the point of having snowplows in a city that is paralyzed by snow relatively infrequently? Better to muddle through than to pay the price of buying and maintaining a big fleet. Uh,
And not
Texas,
spending the money on something else, right?
well, Texas, one of the big attractors of the much talked about immigration surge to Texas is low prices, including low energy prices. You get low energy prices when regulators don't force utilities to prepare for low probability, high impact events. So here
Right.
we are.
Right. Linda, did you weigh in on this topic? I'm sorry if I'm worried that I'm
Nope,
forgetting
I
people.
did.
Okay. All right. Very good. All right. Let us turn now to considering the contribution to our national life by Rush Limbaugh, who died this week of lung cancer. This is tough. You're not supposed to speak ill of the dead. And But honestly, I really do. I think that an honest evaluation of his impact on America requires us to not only to be honest. So Damon, I saw this morning that you had a new piece up about his influence, and why don't you start us off?
Yeah, well, I mean, I wrote a piece about that sort of is inflected through my own experience as a former conservative when I used to work at First Things magazine in the early 2000s, and just reflecting on the way we on staff at that magazine and at similar magazines thought about Rush Limbaugh back then. And we didn't think about him much. We knew he was out there. Occasionally, we'd turn on the radio and hear him and kind of snicker at the jokes and the little bits that he would do mocking things. But we didn't really attend to it because we saw our role as intellectuals as different than that. We were conservatives. We were in favor of crafting arguments and trying to use our consequential ideas, to use the Richard Weaver line about ideas having consequences, using ideas to change the country and make it better and elevate it. There was definitely a feeling of kind of nobility and honor to what we were trying to do. And we all sort of, I think, tacitly recognize that, Rush Limbaugh's kind of slumming it. He's kind of playing to the rabble, if you will. And that has its place. It's important. We need to, keep the voters animated and eager to show up on election day. And he helps with that. And we all want the same thing ultimately. So let him do what he does. We'll do what we do. The strange thing, though, is that as conservatives, one thing that we believed in, or a couple of things we believed in, was that you have to cultivate morality. You have to cultivate virtue. You do this by habituation. You do it by giving people exemplifications to model yourself after. And none of us seem to really contemplate, I wonder if there'll be a bad consequence of the fact that millions of people every day are being taught that politics is insulting your opponents. In the 90s, making fun of the appearance of the president's teenage daughter week after week, month after month. Calling feminists Nazis for years to yuck laughs, and on and on and on. And yet the fact, I think, is that if you want to understand, as I think Bill was talking about very nicely a little while ago and talking about Trump, if you want to understand where Trump came from and how the Republican Party has ended up where it is, I think you need to look at that influence that a whole generation of young conservatives grew up listening to Rush Limbaugh, and they they assimilated themselves to an outlook on politics that is all about exactly what Trump does. It's just insult mongering, demonizing your opponents, never really engaging in a good faith argument with something the other side is saying, let alone the best example of what the other side is saying. It's always looking for the worst example of your opponent and then amplifying that and using it to tar the entire other side and make fun of them, and on and on and on. And so I think there have been a lot of pieces written in the last day or so about the kind of Limbaugh Trump connection, but I do think one sadly ironic dimension of it is the blindness of conservatives to the expected consequence of having somebody out there modeling that form of politics so loudly for so many years and not realizing it would have an effect.
Linda, I don't know if you feel this way. Looking back, I actually sensed a change in Limbaugh over the years. When he first became popular, he was over the top sometimes, no question about it, but he was funny and irreverent and seemed to be really interested in conservative ideas. And I don't know. And then as time went on, he began to get more and more weird, seeming to want to appeal to the Alex Jones types in the audience, engaging in more conspiracy thinking. Did you see that, or am I imagining things?
No, I don't think you're imagining things. Let me state at the outset that I was never a Rush Limbaugh fan. It was not somebody whose program I listened to. It's just not my style of debate. I don't like big egos. I don't like people who are so enamored of themselves that they become the focus. And that was always who Rush Limbaugh was. But I will
Yep.
tell you that while I wasn't a fan of Rush Limbaugh's, he was for a time a fan of mine. He would
Oh yeah.
occasionally read my columns. He probably read from your columns as well
Hmm.
on his program. And, that was nice to expose me. I would hear about it from people who would tuned in, and then I would look and see my book sales going up immediately afterwards.
In my
That was
case, it was
helpful.
like the UPS delivery guy be like, "Oh, you're
Yeah,
that
right.
Mona Chen."
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
I had that
yeah.
happen in 7-Eleven at one time. So yeah, but I will tell you where one thing he really turned around on was on immigration. I mean, he was in the early days a Ronald Reagan type Republican who believed that immigrants worked hard, they contributed. And he was not nativist in that. And my guess is he probably had a lot of fans out there in the Hispanic community, just as Donald Trump does. But he went from being my fan to being somebody who targeted me. He went on a tirade. I think it was in 2007 or so. I wrote a column in which I talked about immigration, and I talked about the xenophobia on the right. I had a long exchange, a symposium, a National Review, because people like Ramesh Ponnuru didn't think much of my column either. And he really went after me, and it was all on immigration. And he sort of keyed into that as an issue. And earlier, Bill was talking about the base of the party and how it was, more populist. It didn't really uphold conservative principles. And I think Bill is right on this. And it certainly started with the Tea Party movement. One of the reasons I didn't like the Tea Party movement was not just that I think populism is often dangerous, but also because they went after immigration and immigrants in particular. And he became really a force in shutting down any chance of immigration reform. And I remember during the George W. Bush administration being called in for a meeting with the president and others backing the bill and having a conversation with him about the malign influence of talk radio and Fox News and other outlets. But Fox, even then, was not quite as bad as it later became. And
Mhm.
Limbaugh was very much the leader of this. So he did help. I think he, like Trump, he knew his audience, he played to his audience, and then he took his audience to darker and darker places. I don't wish anyone ill. I'm sorry that he suffered from a very painful disease, but I am not sorry to see him off the airwaves.
Um, Will, one of the one of the first things that made me realize that there was some distance between me and people that I thought were sort of simpatico politically and intellectually was a few years back. I don't remember when I stopped listening to Rush Limbaugh. And by the way, he attacked me too on his show, Linda, later on in his in more recent years. But so I stopped listening to him a long time ago. But I remember having a conversation with a Washington prominent Washington D.C. conservative journalist when Rush had some sort of a health scare. I don't remember what it was, but he said, this person said to me, "Boy, can you imagine what it would be like without Rush?" And I was shocked. I thought, "You've got to be kidding!" I mean, Rush Limbaugh, he's a carnival barker, he's a clown, he's whatever. And but no, this guy was a real fan, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. I guess that anyway. So 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 Will, one of the things that I do think he came to personify, and that's why the comparisons with Trump are perfectly fair, is that because he kept saying, "I'm just an entertainer, I'm just an entertainer," but he misled his audience all the time. He would lie, he would shade things, and he would always do it with this conspiratorial wink toward the audience, like he was letting them in on secret knowledge. And there's something about people, I don't know, maybe it's also true on the left, but I know it is also true for some people on the left. But certainly there's this tremendous appetite on the right, perhaps because the mainstream media does tend to lean left, the NPRs and the mainstream newspapers and television stations and so on are more on the left and sort of liberal side of the spectrum. And so, when somebody on the right says that they're going to invite you into what's really going on, the things that the major media won't tell you, it's like catnip. And he really perfected that. And he laid the groundwork for Trump to say, don't believe anything that you get from the mainstream media. It's all lies. It's all fake.
Yeah, and I think it's really unfortunate for conservatism and for the United States and for the world that the person who filled that role was Rush Limbaugh. I'm sorry that I don't have anything nice to say about him, but we are more than 24 hours past his death at this point, and the truth is that societies decay, bad things happen, they rot, and some people are just fundamental parts of the rot, and that's what Rush Limbaugh was. He was, I think it's true that when he first started, it was a breath of fresh air for a lot of people who are conservative leaning and felt that, the media were liberal and biased. And here was somebody who at least spoke to them, who they could relate to. But he was fundamentally juvenile and mean. And
Mhm.
I think he did three things. I think he promoted a focus on ideology over facts. That is, when there was information that contradicted his party line, he told people to stand by the party line, and that's where the lies came in. But he promoted this whole way of thinking where we don't absorb information that's contrary to what we want to believe. And of course, that's very prominent today. He also promoted the feeling of focusing on social camaraderie, of having your buddies on the right who all agree about things over thinking. right? He just you weren't really supposed to think so much because I mean the phrase for people who followed Limbaugh was literally ditto heads, right? We all
Mhm.
they all agreed. I'm not saying they all agreed about everything, but that was what he promoted. That was what the culture was. And the third thing is that he, although I say he's ideological, was ideological. He really elevated the ascent of resentments over ideas, at least on the right. So that instead of believing in anything that used to be in the Republic, we don't even have a Republican Party platform anymore. But
Mhm.
what we have is owning the libs, right? And Limbaugh was always about digging and hurting and insulting, and his followers loved that. And the problem with that is there's not even a percentage chance that you might be promoting the right ideas because you're not promoting any ideas at all. You're just going with what feels good, and what feels good to those folks was hurting other people. So we're left with this paradox that this man died and we'd like to say something nice and we don't want to say speak ill of the dead, but that is what Rush Limbaugh did for a living, was to speak ill of the dead, of Michael J. Fox, of people who died of AIDS, of countless people who suffered or died. And so I'm sorry, but that is the legacy of Rush Limbaugh.
Yeah, Bill, he played, of course, a key role. Some people thought, obviously wrongly, that in 2016, perhaps he would be the voice, or maybe even late 2015, he would be the voice on the right who could stand athwart Donald Trump's rise and say, "No, this man is not a true conservative. He's a fraud, and don't follow him. Don't believe him." But of course, he didn't do that. And later, after all those years of saying that he was conducting a seminar on conservatism over the airways. I can't remember what he called it. Something like, your conservative center. I don't remember, but as you see, I didn't listen to it for a long time. But in fact, sort of is similar to what you were saying about the Tea Party. He wasn't really conservative at all, because he was perfectly happy to get behind Trump, and said when he was explaining this that it wasn't about conservatism. It was about, I don't know what, but he said it wasn't about conservatism.
Uh, well, I now find myself in an interesting position, Mona, because the item I had reserved for my looking across the other side,
Yeah.
the close, is now so germane that I'm going to have to do it now. Uh,
Okay.
and because you've just teed it up perfectly. Uh, I I think Limbaugh taught us that ideas may have power, but emotions have more power than ideas. And by the way, I think that's true. And it's a pretty deep truth about politics, unfortunately. And he also taught us, and this is building on what Will said, that of the emotions in politics, the negative ones are much more effective than the positive ones. And uh, and the appeal to resentment may be the most effective appeal of all. And so here is what Limbaugh said in January of 2016. Uh, he said, there are a lot of people in this country who are conservative, but that's not the glue that unites them. If it were, uh, if conservatism were the glue, the belief and understanding of deep, commonly understood conservative principles, if that's what defined people as conservative and was the glue that made the conservative movement a big movement, then Trump would have no chance. This is January of 2016, mind you.
Yep.
He literally would have no choice, because whatever he is, he's not and never has been a doctrinaire conservative. If conservatism were this widely understood, deeply held belief system, then outsiders like Trump would not stand a prayer of getting support from people. Yet he is. And then How does Rush explain this? The thing that's in front of everybody's face, and it's apparently so hard to believe, is this united, virulent opposition to the left. And I, for the life of me, don't know what is so hard to understand about that. Uh, I think I think that the evidence was on Limbaugh's side 5 years ago, and it's even more on his side now. It is the enactment of antipathy that is the real motivating force here. And resentment is not something you create. It's something, whose existence you divine, usually intuitively. And your job then, as an entertainer or as a political leader, is to mobilize that resentment. And doing that, making it legitimate to say the previously unsayable, is to politics as cracking the atom is to energy. Boom.
Yeah. And in the case of Limbaugh, exploiting that resentment made him fabulously wealthy. He made an estimated $85 million a year, and also gave him tremendous power. And in the case of Donald Trump, exploiting that resentment obviously allowed him to nearly destroy the country. So it is very, very powerful. All right. Well, let us now turn to our final segment, things that we would like to highlight. And Linda had to leave early, so she's back next week. Damon, let's start with you.
Okay, I hope it's okay if I actually go off the proverbial reservation and leave politics behind for a moment. Although I guess in the broadest sense of politics, there's a political dimension to this, given how much time we've spent on recent shows talking about things like culture in the New York Times and kind of canceling and what you're allowed to say in public. I just want to draw attention to that there is a massive authoritative biography of Philip Roth coming out in a couple of months by Blake Bailey. He's the author of a biography of John Cheever that was very well received, and he worked very closely with Roth for the better part of a decade before Roth's death on this book, and it's very anticipated. I've been really looking forward to it, and I just want to point out it still might be worth reading. It still might be very good, but the new issue of Harper's Magazine has a review of it titled "The Possessed" by Joshua Cohen. That is the most just mind-blowingly vicious takedown I've read in a long time, and I do think that there has been a kind of diminishment of good, very tough criticism over the last decade as people have become more skittish about being nasty, because I guess you're only allowed to be nasty in a meta way. So in other words, someone comes out and says something and then they get attacked by everybody online saying you're not allowed to say that. In saying the criticism of the critic, you're allowed to be nasty, but the criticism itself is not supposed to be as much. But this piece, it takes Joshua Cohen, the critic, writes it as if he's himself Philip Roth reviewing the book. And this is a trope that doesn't always work, but he pulls it off very well, and it is just a vicious takedown of this biography. And if you care about ideas and are interested in Roth and literature, it's a really great work of criticism. So I don't know if you can get it yet on open access Harper's website, but hopefully they'll let it out soon for non-subscribers, and look for it. It's titled again "The Possessed" by Joshua Cohen, a review of the Philip Roth biography coming from Blake Bailey.
Well, there may be some people in this world who are above enjoying a great takedown, but I'm not one of them.
Glad to hear it.
Bill, did you want to jump in next?
No,
Oh,
I
okay, because I
already,
saw
I
your
already
hand up.
used,
Okay.
I already, it's not. I already used my material,
Okay.
but
Okay. Very good. Yeah. Go ahead.
I will just comment very briefly uh, that I have thought very hard as an author and also a longtime book reviewer of the ethics of book reviewing, and especially what it means to be on the other end of that kind of review.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I think that kind of review, you know, bespeaks a taste. I haven't read the review, but I'll rely on Damon's characterization of it. Reflects a taste for cruelty, right? And an urge to destroy. Uh, that I think merits uh, condemnation and not praise. This is a moral judgment. I do not like people who enjoy being mean to other people, and I'm not sure anybody should.
Okay. Well, I of course agree with that, but we'd have to see the review first
We
before
do.
we really knew. But there are. So I'll tell you. Just recently, one of my sons, who's getting a PhD in history, directed me to a historian's website where they were discussing the various things regarding the 1619. Anyway. There was a takedown by one historian of another that was not like purposely to be mean, but it was just so comprehensive and showed so thoroughly why the first guy was wrong that it was like a pleasure to read. I mean, it was just wow, that is the way you do intellectual combat, and there's a
That's
place for
fine,
that.
and
Yeah,
that's fine,
yeah,
right? But it depends on what your motive is.
yeah. And it also depends on the words you choose and so forth. I mean,
Well,
some things that are just meant to be personally lacerating are obviously out of bounds.
and I would urge Bill to actually read the review before he uses it as an exemplification of a vice.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Good
Okay,
idea.
but Damon, as you presented it, you know, my characterization was of your presentation was almost irresistible.
Okay.
Okay, Will Saletan, what have you got for us?
Okay, so when the Pfizer and Moderna COVID vaccines came out, we were told that they were 94 to 95% effective after you get the first shot and then the booster shot. But if you only did the first shot, they were only about 50% effective. It now turns out that this week this was actually published as just correspondence in the New England Journal of Medicine on Wednesday, that a couple of scientists reanalyzed the data because they pointed out that 50% figure of immunity from the first dose was based on including people who had just gotten the first shot. In other words, people within the first 2 weeks after getting the first shot who dramatically diluted the efficacy of the vaccine because they didn't have the immunity yet. So what these folks did was they reanalyzed the data based on starting after 2 weeks after the first dose.
Yeah.
And they found that it was 92% effective. 92%. That is 2 points shy of the full effectiveness after the second dose, which immediately raises the question, why in God's name are we withholding any vaccine doses from anyone who does not yet have it? That is to say, we are scheduling second doses for people when other people haven't had the first dose. If these numbers are correct, and this is preliminary, but it's highly likely that they will turn out to be largely correct, we absolutely should be giving everybody these vaccines, one dose to everybody before we do anything with a second dose.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. There was a piece that ran actually in the Washington Post, I think it was on Sunday, by an economist at George Mason named Alex Tabarrok, I think, at the Mercatus Center, who was making this point. And so, yeah, there are things. I'm just hoping that the relevant decision makers will see this and change course, because it totally. I mean, it seems to me to make sense, and I would want the experts to weigh in. But yeah, that's really, really important. Thank you for that. All right. I wanted to draw attention to a piece that appeared in the American Purpose magazine, which I think Bill is on the editorial board of. It's called 1619 versus 1776, and it was by Daniel. I don't know if it's Chirot, Chirot, um, and um, and it's an interesting reflection on our fights about our history. And he has some really, I think, interesting observations about the fact that all countries, when they tell their stories, tend to lie a little bit about their past and to, smooth over the rough places and so forth, and even, engage in a little myth making. But he says, this isn't entirely a terrible thing. I mean, you need heroes. And so it got me to thinking about the different ways it might be appropriate to approach the teaching of history based on the age of children, right? I mean, when they're little, they're too young to really understand complexity much, and so you tell the basic outlines of the story, and you have your heroes, and then when maybe they're a little older, you can start introducing the difficulties that people are flawed and nobody's perfect, and that our founders were slave owners, and sometimes not so nice slave owners either. I mean, sometimes people want to smooth that over too by saying, well, were they nice to their slaves? Well, I mean, when you enslave someone, you're not being nice to them. Anyway, so it's a very interesting piece, I think, with some really good observations. American Purpose, 1619 versus 1776. So thank you, Will Saletan, for joining us. Thank you, listeners. Please rate and review us and leave feedback. My email is available on the Bulwark website, where you can find my writing as well, and that of many others. And so we thank you all for listening, and we will be back next week as every week.